You're watching Bottomline Africa. Thank you for staying with us. Let me reintroduce my guests. We have Abel Oyeyo, who's an international relations analyst. We have Javas Bigambo, who's a governance analyst, expert rather. And we have Nakia White, who's a political strategist, and Mark Bichachi, who's a political analyst as well. Thank you for staying with us on Bottomline Africa. We're focusing on the speech by President Uhuru Kenyatta, who was sworn in as the President of the Republic of Kenya for his second term. And part of what he had to say was that he thanked Kenya's friends in the international community for standing with Kenya, saying Kenya is a proud member of the community of nations. Maybe we can get that at some point on air. And saying Kenya will always work hard to remain a force for good. Nakia, listening into that, he was not specific about Kenya's relation with the international community. And if you ask me, there was no direct link between, in what he said between Kenya and the international community. 3/4 of his speech focused on East African community. What does that say to you?
Oh, I think, again, his speech was nationalist, right? It was inward looking. So I think for him not to mention any international communities, it goes in line with kind of, I think, what his thinking is. And you all also have to remember the last election, the last time that he won, that the UK, Britain, and the US kind of, kept arm's length away from his presidency and congratulating him because of the ICC case. So, I think that maybe there might be some residue from that. And you also have to remember from the August the 8th election, where the United States also came in, as well as other cohorts from around the world, and reviewed the election. So there was also some discrepancy there. So there may be just, perhaps, sour feelings from that, and certainly from the last election. I think that's one piece, but I think the biggest mind frame for President Uhuru Kenyatta is that he's looking inward, and he's looking to build Kenya, and certainly looking to be the leader of East Africa. So for him not to have any real conversation or mention any of the international players, I think with his mindset makes sense.
Javas, he's looking to be the leader of East Africa, do you think?
You see, Linda, when you analyze the president's speech by text and soundbite, you realize that his appeal to the East African region or community is very impressive. But the speech was very limited. In fact, unimpressively thin when it comes to matters foreign policy and the standing of Kenya, the position of Kenya in how it's going, and it will relate with other nations beyond the East African community in matters of governance, human rights, etc. There are a couple of other limitations I don't want to go into, for example, matters of accountability, which were excluded from the speech, matters of war and graft, etc., and all those other things that I think are very important on matters of good governance. However, by the demonstration of invitation to various leaders that were there today, and of course when you include even the Israeli premier who came in later, it demonstrates that his administration has made effort to reach out to invite other heads of state and government to this function.
Okay.
But you see, the availability of those leaders here does not necessarily guarantee the legitimacy or authenticity of his administration, because that's purely a matter of sovereignty, which is an internal issue. And when an invitation is extended to any leader, it is incumbent upon that leader, or by way of prior commitments or etc., to honor that or not. There has been an issue, for example, about the lack or the absence of the Tanzanian president. But remember that the deputy president of Tanzania was in attendance. The deputy president, for example, of Nigeria was in attendance. And, for example, you know very well that question of delegation arises when a president is not able to attend a particular function and the deputy is sent or the vice president is sent. That demonstrates the goodwill from that kind of administration.
Okay.
So I think we need not limit ourselves narrowly to say that Tanzania does not have the goodwill to relate with Kenya just because President Magufuli did not attend and his vice president attended.
So we shouldn't read too much into it.
Well, I think there is little to read into that. However, it would have been a very good thing if the president himself would have come. But suppose there were other prior commitments, it would have been, of course, a good thing for him to come. The other thing would be, for example, when you look at the southern part of the continent, South Africa the South African president was not in attendance. It would have been a very good thing if at all the South African president and many other presidents, for example, within the East African community, the West African region, the SADC, would have been in attendance. But you see, it is all incumbent upon their own imagination, will, and prior arrangements and diaries to come or to honor such invitation.
Okay, Mark, like I mentioned, James Orengo was, today when he was addressing some of the supporters, he said, if you want to know this is an illegitimate government, you need to look at the kind of leaders who are there. And Java says probably we shouldn't read too much into it. Looking at the leaders who are there at the swearing ceremony today, does the issue of legitimacy come to question for you?
If a couple gets married, is the wedding invalidated by the number of guests who show up? You know,
why did I see that coming?
You know, because there are certain questions as Kenyans, really, we need to stop asking. And the reason why I say this is this. We have processes that by which we have decided as a nation when we voted for the Constitution in 2010 that would tell us what is a legitimate president, okay? A legitimacy is not something that we decide. You understand? It's like me deciding that Linda Ogutu is a good host or not. I am not the be-all and end-all of that decision. And this kind of decision-making on the part mostly of the opposition is dangerous because come 2022, should they win, then they are setting up the stage that any Tom, Dick, and Harry can wake up and say that this particular president is invalid. And the thing is, we as a country need to commit to ourselves to the processes that we've chosen. We've put an IEBC in place that holds an election. If we have a problem with IEBC, we go to the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court says that this is a legitimate election, whatever your misgivings, the rule of law behooves all of us to come to the conclusion that this is a legitimate presidency. And I'm honestly tired of having conversations about legitimacy based on arbitrary feelings that people have. Let's come back to the facts. And the fact of the matter is this, and I accept that the country has issues to deal with. That is true. However, one of the issues we are not dealing with anymore is the legitimacy of a presidency. Let's separate our tribalism from trying to nitpick about things. You know, we're acting like girls who don't like each other when they are young, and they say, you know what, I don't like the color purple. Cindy looks so bad in it. And that's what we want to discuss, how Cindy looks in her colors. The truth of the matter is you don't like Cindy. Cindy does not like you. Let's discuss you not disliking each other, but let's not discuss things that are already set in stone.
So, from where you sit, who attended, who did not attend, has nothing to do with the legitimacy.
It's absolutely, listen, when I had the privilege of attending the inauguration in Ghana, Kenya was represented by Deputy President William Ruto. There was no debate about why Uhuru Kenyatta did not show up. The president of Nigeria did not show up, and he's the direct neighbor of Ghana. So when we begin to read into everything, let's also read into the fact that it did not rain today. Let's read into the fact how many people showed up. Let's stop being petty as a country. We have issues. Let's talk about the real issue.
Okay, so let's talk about the real issues, like you put it. Abel, this is where you come in. In terms of foreign policy, in the next 5 years, of course, President Uhuru Kenyatta has had the initial 5. I'd like you to point out for me some of the successes in terms of foreign policy and where the administration should now be heading in the next 5 years.
Sorry, could you kindly...
I'm saying President Uhuru Kenyatta has been in power for the last 5 years, and you're an international relations expert. Could you look at the successes that this administration has had for the last 5 years in terms of foreign policy and probably chart a way forward for this administration for the next 5?
Well, it's quite unfortunate, according to the analysis we've done, that the president has not been able to make so much progress in terms of international, relations achievements. The first flop, of course, was Amina Mohammed. She was poised to become the AU chairperson. She lost it to someone else, the guy from Chad. A lot of money was spent. A lot of traveling was done, but it came to naught. It didn't yield the kind of fruits we expected because I believe the candidate was weak, and I don't know how they were not able to say that. So that was a mistake. It was a foreign policy failure. Look at the East African community. Just recently, chicks were, burnt in...
in Tanzania.
In Tanzania. So that means we have a problem. There is some kind of frosty relationship between Kenya and our immediate neighbor, Tanzania. The only success that I can be able to point out is what was achieved when President Uhuru and Deputy President Ruto were able to actually get out of ICC. That is when a lot of diplomacy was, on display, and they were able to, of course, successfully end the cases. Now, from that point going forward, I don't think they invested so much time, apart from the Amina Mohammed fail, of course. Maybe that is why they've not been able to make so much progress. So from now going forward, there's so much to be done within the region itself. We have to find out what's going on between Kenya and Tanzania, because I think what's on display is not very, promising. Now, as a president, when you don't want to show what we call open warmth to your neighbor, you don't show up yourself. You send a low-ranking official. That is the message we get from the presence of the Vice President of Tanzania and not Magufuli himself. If Trump wants to make sure he sends a message of lack of that close connection with Britain, he'll send someone like State Secretary Rex Tillerson or someone
Secretary
else.
of State, yes.
That is it. So the fact that Magufuli didn't show up and, he's our immediate neighbor, given what has been happening, sends a very, very negative message. So the president had to find out what's going on within the East African community.
Okay.
And something else I think we have to point out. There's limited progress you can make when you don't have what we call legitimacy. There's a difference between the legal nature of opposition and legitimacy. Legality comes from the Constitution. From where I'm sitting, I believe the president is legal. The constitutional mechanisms have been, implemented.
Yeah.
Every process has been adhered to and all that. Legitimacy comes from the people. Now, we have a section of the country, around 40%, 45%, which is not contented. Okay, what I like is the president himself understands we have a problem. Of course, we have self-serving elites around him who cannot appreciate that because of their interest, but the president understands we have a problem. And he has to reach out. That is how you get legitimacy. Now, something else. The international community can only be able to deal with you when you have what we call home ground legitimacy. Legitimacy comes from what we call triangulation of so many factors. Now, if your people like you, your neighbors like you, you can have a voice in the international community. You can make a decision, it can be respected, you can lobby for some position, and it can be, supported. So the president, going forward, number one, has to make sure he builds what we call home ground legitimacy. Once that is accomplished, then now he can reach out to the rest of course, like I said earlier, starting with the East African community, then he can reach out to the rest of the world. And, most, especially West African leaders, once they, retire, they get appointments to serious regional and sometimes international bodies.
Okay.
Now, if you have a bad history as a leader, you don't have legitimacy, you have a history of talk about things like oppression, you cannot get that kind of recognition. I was impressed by the presence of Mbeki because he was part of the Africa Observer, the EU Observer mission, which means his presence is some kind of endorsement.
And he was there today?
He was there today. That is an endorsement of the process and the man. That is the president. So what we need to do is see a president who is going to actually not listen to those guys who are telling him everything is okay, and he gets to reach out. And I think that is the message he's gotten from the Britons and the Americans, because they have a lot of interest in terms of security in Kenya.
Nakia, the international community cannot deal with you if you have issues with home ground legitimacy. How do you think the president should address this?
I think the president should just be president. I mean, he's president. He was inaugurated today. He had a huge procession. So I think he should just carry on being president. But I do want to jump back for a second and talk a bit about the foreign policy and kind of dovetail off of my fellow panelist and say that, listen, Kenya has been the host for so many important panels and conferences, including, WTO, GES, when President Obama came to visit, TCAD, UNCCAD, AGRF, so many really important international conferences. And that really does say something about Kenya, and certainly it being positioned as a country with the ease of doing business with the World Bank. It is really something to say in terms of kind of his trade policy and the international trade policy I think that he's looking to build. I mean, the one thing that I would caution is the deepening relationship and loans and debt from China. I think that would be in terms of looking forward, that would be one of the things that I would certainly caution the president about. And making sure that we don't mortgage Kenya or parts of Africa off to the east. So yeah, that would be kind of what I would think about in terms of the way forward.
Mark Bichachi, Oyeyo says that, like I said, the international community will not deal with you if you have issues of home ground legitimacy. And President Uhuru today, while he was addressing Kenyans, made reference to the East African community and the fact that we need to move together as a region and make sure that we prosper. So from listening into that speech today, how then does Kenya move forward and increase her influence, not only in the region, but in the entire world?
First thing first is let's understand that the Americans are building a superhighway between Mombasa and Nairobi. Let me tell you, like Jesus said, where your treasure is, your heart will be also. So if there is treasure in Kenya, they're there. Let's not treat foreign relations like the West is this super altruistic entity that deals with Africa based on morality and the principles and stuff like that. Okay. The truth is they're rent seekers most of the time. And the honest truth is, as long as there's a buck to be made, we'll be just fine. That's the reality. And now, from that point, actually, this is very interesting. What Uhuru Kenyatta has just done is quite brilliantly sorted out a lot of the issues that we've had within the Eastern African region. And here's what he's done. We could have played hardball diplomacy and said, you know what, Tanzania, you took our cows, you took our livestock.
Chicks, you took our cows.
Yes, and then you took our island in Migingo and stuff like that, and let's fight about that. Instead, we've become the bigger man as a country, and we've said, you know what, since these are the issues that are going on, we're going to raise the bar a little bit, and let's actually implement what it means to be in the East African community. And let's not kid ourselves. Our borders are quite porous between Uganda and Kenya and between Tanzania and Kenya. I have seen people literally walk between the border as though it's a walk to the shop. And this
that happens a lot in Busia.
Exactly. This happens all the time. If you go to Busia, if you go to Namanga, it happens a lot. So recognizing it and giving it a legal option is a smart move, and that's what we need to do. We need to be able to set the example. You cannot complain about Uganda's behavior if you as Kenya are not behaving any better. So, and that is something, by the way, that I would like the president to implement internally into the country, because what we need to do is to come to that point where this imagined difference, and I call it imagined because, you know, Kenyans, we are an interesting lot.
Mark, people have burnt your cheeks and they've taken your cows. Those are imaginary differences.
No, yes, they're imaginary differences. And let me give you an example. In 2007, Kenyans had the biggest issue. It was a tiff between the Kikuyu and the Kalenjin, and we thought they'll never make up. And in 2013 and in 2017, once again, they've proven that they can sit in the same place. Our differences in the region and within the country are very, 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 very petty and easy to deal with.
Mark, I need to let Javas Bigambo have the final word on this. Mark, so Javas, so Mark said the president was being very strategic. Probably he knew what he was saying with respect to foreign policy and the East African nation. What are your thoughts as we wrap this up?
Well, Mark has become all preachy like Paul of Tarsus, trying to reach out to the Macedonians. But it's not bad after all.
Yeah.
When it comes to reflections on matters foreign policy in the speech of the president, the fabric was not sufficient to make a complete suit, because there are a couple of other things, loose ends, that were left unattended to. For example, while he opened up the borders of Kenya to the entry of the East African community members, he did not actually specifically speak to the worth of the Kenyan citizenship and how it's going to be protected. For example, appreciate the issue, for example, of the Migingo factor. The other thing is, remember the Kenyans that had been apprehended in the cells of South Sudan and other places. You realize that the worth of the Kenyan citizenship is something that the president did not pay attention to. That even though he has demonstrated the goodwill of Kenya and Kenyans, that the other countries as well, without the issue of reciprocity, should actually return the favor of also respecting Kenya and the Kenyans, and that actually Kenya will go out of its way to protect Kenyan citizenship and any Kenyan within the relations of other nations. So that's something that was not given much attention. The other thing is this. You realize that there is the burden of the high cost of living. There is the burden of our skyrocketing debt that actually was also left unattended to. These are things that matter to us as Kenyans. It would have been important for the president to speak to this and how we are going to relate even further, yes, to these Bretton Woods institutions, etc. Moving forward, right now, the president actually should get down to the urgent task of uniting all Kenyans. I reject as untrue the assertion that was made by my brother Oyueyo that the international community will not deal with any president who has got legitimacy issues at home. Look, right now, in South Sudan, for example, there are critical legitimacy issues and all these wars, the civil war that has been sustained for so long. That does not mean that the international community has failed to deal with South Sudan. And remember, the question of even legitimacy is a housekeeping issue, a question of sovereignty that is protected by our constitution. The principle of non-interference of the issues of other nations applies. And that is why even this matter having been settled by the Supreme Court, the international community is obligated to deal with Kenya as it deals with other nations within the framework of the goodwill within the Committee of Nations.
Wow. Okay. Abel, your final remarks as we close this up?
Okay, let me respond to an issue that has been raised.
Yes, that's why you object to.
When it comes to issues of non-intervention or non-interference and sovereignty. Now, in international relations, we talk about humanitarian intervention, humanitarian concerns as a basis for intervention in some places. Okay. Kenya has not gotten to that level, so I don't even need to address that. But some countries are given that kind of leeway to intervene when there's a problem in a particular country and citizens are perceived to be in the line of danger of fire. For example, what happened in 2003 when the US had to intervene in Iraq. Now, there are cases of what we call self-interest, the pursuit of self-interest. Sometimes back, China was busy buying oil from southern Sudan when there were, cases of serious oppression of the citizens. Now, that kind of behavior is not acceptable in the international, realm of dealings. So sometimes it happens, you can be legitimate back home, but then again, some selfish nations can come in and do what? And do business with you. Now, I'm not saying the president, as he stands now, is illegitimate, yet it just has issues he has to deal with. The issues we have are not yet too big to be shared with the rest of the world. Dialogue can actually help solve them. Okay. And something else that I might have to maybe add is...
yeah, because I need to wrap up. Yeah.
When it comes to issues like opening our borders to the rest of, these African community members and maybe the rest of the, our African brothers and sisters to move in, what you need to do first is to secure borders. That one has to be done. As we speak now, guys can just walk in from Ethiopia and kill our people. Our police and our other institutions are very corrupt. They can take very small amounts of money and actually allow terrorists to walk in. Before you can open the borders like that, you have to make sure we have systems of verifying who's who before you can give them what? Okay. Visas. So I think Parliament has to actually move in and make sure the process is done in a very careful way so as to secure our people.
Mark Bichachi, your final comments.
I think Kenya is at a wonderful space, and it's at a wonderful space because we have two options. Option number one is to support Uhuru Kenyatta, and option number two is to push Uhuru Kenyatta to give you what you want. And that's the best place we can be as a country, where we have the opportunity that he's sold us a grand vision for the nation, international relations notwithstanding. And that grand vision, whether you take the SGR or the reduced rates for manufacturers in terms of electricity, or the promise of education, all of this tells us that by 2022, we have a scorecard by which to mark the excellence of this government. And it should be the focus of every citizen to make sure that this Jubilee administration is forced, literally, to deliver on what they said. And that is the grand opportunity for our nation.
Nakia, you get the final word, man.
So just as President Uhuru Kenyatta is building relationships and positioning himself as the leader of East Africa, I think the same thing needs to happen within Kenya, is positioning himself and healing the differences and the divides within Kenya and the tribal differences. I think as a leader, it is his duty to do that, and I'm certain that he'll work towards that in the next couple of months. We'll be able to see.
All right, people, thank you so much for your contribution on Bottom Line Africa this evening. I thank you for your insights and for your thoughts on the President's speech with respect to foreign policy. Nakia White, Managing Partner, Global Lad and Political Strategist. We also had Abel Oyeyo, Research and International Relations Expert. We had Javas Bigambo, who's a governance expert, and Mark Bichach, who's a political commentator. Thank you so much for your time this evening. Have a good night. I'm Linda Ogutu. We'll see you tomorrow again on Bottom Line Africa.